This reconstruction gives at least a flavor of what life would have looked like in Dublin in the 10th century. And this is what Dublin probably looked like in about 1000. The buildings were made of wood and wattle, and they included houses and workshops, sheds, latrines, and possibly even a ceremonial platform. And you can see that there are actually timber roads throughout the settlement. They were probably not that comfortable to travel on, but they were there. Now, why do you bother to put a bunch of logs down? If you've ever spent any time in Ireland, you know that something wet comes out of the sky pretty much every day. And I actually lived there for 3.5 months one time. It literally rained for at least a part of every day that I was there. So this kind of walkway that you see in this scale model reconstruction would have been enormously helpful in counteracting the tendency of the roads to become muddy quagmires. You can also see at the bottom of the slide, very rudimentary stairways leading up from the river where the boats would moor alongside. So this is definitely a maritime city. Now we can make this reconstruction because of excavations that were done in the 1970s that helped archaeologists to determine the outline of the settlement and the kinds of materials that were used to build it. I just find this picture amazing. They're actually able to find the medieval Viking city. Here is another view that shows you one of the larger Viking dwellings. And it just gives me goosebumps to look at this and think that real people actually lived in this house, of which only the outlines remain. Excavations of the Viking settlement in Dublin have been extensive. The interesting point being that some people initially objected to spending taxpayer money on this. Some people didn't want to dig up the Vikings because they had gotten a very bad press over time, but they finally relented, and the result is just some fabulous artifacts, and you can just see a couple of them on the slide. Now, of course, Dubliners are very excited about their Viking heritage. At Christchurch Place in Dublin, you can see this evocation of the artifacts found underneath, and they've been set into the paving stones of the street. I think this is really just a fabulously fun evocation of the archaeological riches of Viking Dublin. Some of the objects found are very quotidian, like these bone and antler combs, but still you can see that quite a lot of care was taken to adorn them. Okay. But some, of course, confirm the reputation of the Vikings as warriors. You can see these Viking swords in the Viking section of the National Museum of Archaeology in Dublin, which is by far my favorite place in the whole city. I always go there when I am in Dublin. I hang out at the Archaeological Museum and geek out. Okay. So what was life like in Dublin? By medieval standards, it was a large town. It probably had thousands of inhabitants. It would have been in the basic ballpark of a place like Dublin, like London or Paris. Really, so it was a really substantial settlement. Okay? And on the map, you can see a couple of ways of depicting the sphere of influence that the city would have exerted, the kind of hinterland argument about medieval cities. The left-hand one is kind of a minimalist version. The right-hand one is more of a maximalist version. But you can see there basically that the influence of the Vikings is mostly around those coastal settlements. Doesn't extend too far inland, although Dublin is the most extensive because it is the largest. Okay. The reason that this hinterland is so extensive is because the agricultural production of the region around Dublin was actually impacted by the presence of the city. People reorganized their agricultural way of life in order to supply the needs of the city. 4,000 people living in Dublin need a lot of food. And one of the things that they need is meat. So in order to feed that many people, you would have had to bring a lot of cows into Dublin. So those cattle are being raised in the area right around Dublin and being brought in to feed those inhabitants. Now, the Vikings who lived there could have raided for them, okay, but they also probably traded for them as well. Okay? And they definitely had an enormous impact on the local economy. The reason they need to bring cattle in is because they are not really farming themselves. They're doing other stuff. Obviously, trade is the most important thing that they're doing. Dublin is in a very good position along the major Viking trade routes that go all around the British Isles and out to Iceland, but also farther east and south. The Vikings brought a huge infusion of cash in the form of silver, much of which had been earned in plunder, but also in trade, okay? Much of it from the Islamic world. And you can see here some decorated lead weights that were used to make all the deals that came about as a result of this trade. As I mentioned earlier, you would need to check the weight of some of those artifacts if you were going to hack them up. Okay? How you can afford all the cows. We know about the trade because Islamic silver dirhams have been found all over the Viking world, many of which passed through Dublin. What you see on the slide is the Store Rockford from the Isle of Skye in Scotland. And a lot of these coins probably passed through Dublin because this was a remote location. This is not where the trading was happening. This is probably where people were when something bad went down and they needed to bury their hoard. Okay? We have other Islamic artifacts as well. For example, this ring, which has an Arabic inscription on it. Some of the artifacts found included silk fibers. At that point, silk fibers could have only come from the East, since the secret of silk manufacture was not known in the West. So this could have been Islamic, it could have been Byzantine. Okay? In both areas, you would have been able to find silk manufacture. Dublin was a stopping off point for the wine, the wool, and the silver that went north, and it was exchanged for fur, amber, and the most important commodity going south from the Scandinavian world, slaves. Okay. And this is the most disturbing part of the story. We might be overselling the amount of plundering of goods that the Vikings did, but we're probably underselling the degree to which they were engaged in the slave trade, because it was probably the most important and valuable commodity that they were involved in trading. The most movable form of wealth in this period is actually people. This terrifying image on the slide is from an exhibit at the museum in Dublin. It's a slave chain and collar. Now, it must be said that the skull on display here was not, in fact, found with the chain and collar. So this is a little bit of over-egging the pudding, as the old expression goes. And I think the reason they chose it is because of the terrible wound to the cranium, sort of the idea that this was someone who died violently in captivity. Possibly, but not necessarily. Still, the artifact by itself, the chain and the collar, that's by itself enough. It's pretty horrifying. Slaves seized in Ireland could be traded locally, brought back to Scandinavia, or indeed traded as far away as the Islamic world. I did find a modern artist's rendering of the slave trade with the Islamic world, but it was too racist to show you. The issue of slavery brings me to one of the most interesting new kinds of evidence for studying the Vikings, and I sort of hinted at this at the very beginning, namely DNA. New research into Viking burials in Ireland has come up with some really interesting findings. The first is something that I've already mentioned, the confirmation that most Vikings in Ireland were from Norway, okay, as opposed to the Vikings who settled in Eastern England, who were largely from Denmark. So I am giving this talk to the right Scandinavian group. The other finding was that a lot of the Vikings who we find buried in Ireland had a significant amount of non-Scandinavian DNA, including Irish DNA. And it is thought that the Irish might have been reaching Scandinavia as part of the slave trade for a long time. and that's where the DNA from Ireland came into the Scandinavian gene pool. Now, of course, once the Norse settled in Ireland, there was intermarriage, and many Irish people now have lots of Scandinavian DNA. Most of us, if we go to 23andMe or Ancestry.com, end up with some very interesting stories to tell about our ancestry. And incidentally, there is no particular reason why I put the Ballandary sword on this map. Slide. It has nothing to do with DNA. I just like it. So let's get back to talking about material culture. As I mentioned earlier in the talk, and as everyone who has ever heard of the Vikings surely knows, they were famous for their ships, and Dublin was a center of shipbuilding. This was a great boon to the Irish economy, since before the Vikings arrived, most Irish boats looked like what you see on this slide. They were simply skin-covered coracles. The kind of boat that is represented by the sea stallion represented quite an improvement. This model of a Viking ship has stood outside the Dublin City Council office since 1997. And apparently people like to sit in it for an impromptu al fresco meal or snack. Just one quick additional artifact to show you to demonstrate that Vikings were not all business, violent or not. This is a wooden gaming board found to the west of Dublin in County Westmeath. It came with wooden pegs that would be moved around in the various holes. And so Vikings relaxed with a little game of Nefertafel when they were tired of trading and raiding. And in fact, you can look up the rules of Nefertafel and you can play it. Okay. Notice that the location of the find in a little bit to the west of Dublin could even indicate that this very Scandinavian game is being played by Irish people, because it comes from an area where probably the people living there were actually Irish, not Norse. And this is an indication that the Vikings were becoming, in a certain sense, just another part of the Irish scene. As the Vikings were increasingly converting to Christianity through the intermarriage and the trading contacts that I've already talked about, the Irish kings feel more and more comfortable working with them and accepting them as clients, as allies. Before long, Viking settlements have effectively been slotted into the native Irish political hierarchy of a few large dynasties competing for the allegiance of small client kingdoms. The Vikings were actually really great allies to have. They weren't really necessarily enemies to get rid of. Of course, they come with tremendous resources. They have friends they can invite and that sort of thing.